I think my role in music as a pianist actually dates before my birth and before even the conception of me. I think it actually goes back 4 years before I was born. And the reason why I say that is because my parents made a very special decision and a fateful decision. They were living in Berlin at the time, and they were both studying music, my mother piano and my father composition. And they didn't have any money. They don't come from families of any means. And then very tragically, my father's father passed away. And they inherited a little bit of money, not that much. And they decided to spend all that money and add to it with a big loan to buy Steinway grand piano, like the one we have here in Louisiana. And they basically had that incredible new Hamburg Steinway piano in their very little student apartment. It's like 40 square meters, if that. And nothing else of anything comparable in quality. And then, I think then my destiny was made. And then they moved back to Iceland 4 years later, 1984, and I was born. And because they had spent all the money and taken a loan on the piano, they couldn't buy an apartment, so we were renting, and then they bought a tiny little apartment, a basement apartment in Reykjavik, and I was sharing a room with my two sisters until I was, 7 or 8 years old when we moved into something slightly bigger. But in those first 6 or 7 years, we had that piano, and the piano was really like a portal. It was what the whole apartment revolved around. My mother was teaching at home on that piano. My father was composing on that piano. I would just see that piano as the center of the world. That's why I say my role as a pianist sort of predates me. I think it was inevitable that at least one of us children would become a pianist, with a piano playing that kind of a role in the household. I think, fundamentally, people are either drawn towards music or not that drawn towards music. It's sort of either or for most people. There's almost no middle ground with music. If you have music in your life, usually it's a big part of your life. Then there's some people that really don't need or want music that much, and then that's that, And I think that with me, I was very much in the former clan. But I also, when you hear that much music so early on in your life, if there's always the sound of a piano in your home, it just becomes like your mother milk a little bit, And I got, from this I got perfect pitch, meaning I can decipher different pitches, on hearing them. And I also developed something that's, it's nice to talk about in the museum context, because it's synesthesia, meaning I associate specific color with specific pitch. And I mean, those two things, they're nothing that special. There are many people who have something like this, but they very often occur in people if they're exposed to a lot of music in this kind of early on period when the brain is sort of, taking everything in and remembering everything. The white keys on the piano, the C would be white, D would be brown, E would be green, F would be blue, and G is red, A is yellow, and B or H is purple. So of course then there are many shades and variants to this. But it doesn't mean that when I play the note C or something that I have like a white filter over my eyes. But it's just a little bit like to me, C is white in the same way that a chair is a chair, or glasses are glasses. Blue is blue. It's just this strong association that I have between those different worlds that is really hard to sort of to explain to people who don't have it. But so if you look at some paintings, like here around, this painting is obviously with a lot of E in it for me, E and D. Those are the pictures in that beautiful painting, behind the piano there, So it just sort of adds to a little sense of fantasy, maybe. But of course, it doesn't make a career or change your life fundamentally. It's just something that is there.
So notes and music pieces become like paintings for you. They have a color structure, and would you compare them to paintings?
In a sense, or maybe I would compare paintings to music. It's this play with basically with architecture and structure and fantasy and colors and space and dimensions. These are all the same subjects that a painter is dealing with, and an architect also, and a composer, and you could also argue an author. Though it's more or less the same subjects in all the arts. Spatial, and then in time, and then all the specifics. But I'm for instance immensely interested in architecture as an art form. I love this house here, for instance. It's a perfect architecture, really, in every way. My father is an architect on top of being a composer, so very often I think about music and pieces very similarly to how I think about houses. I read music sometimes the way I read houses and space. I think the way to differentiate between the good and the great, or the fine and the outstanding, is really the same in all the art forms. It's that question of originality, and whether you see and hear the world, really from your own perspective, as opposed to copying other people's sensations. And I think that, when you look at a piece of music, for instance, for a pianist, I feel very often I can tell right away whether they are simply going into tradition and being very good craftsmen and doing things the way they're supposed to be done, or doing what is the one thing that unites all the great composers and interpreters in history, which is to work with tradition, but not only inside it. I think Bach is so relevant today because there's a sense of modernity to his works that seems to renew itself with each and every generation. I think it has to do with the fact that the music is at the same time extremely dense and maximal in terms of the musical structure and ideas, and also very minimal in the sense that there is almost no instruction from Bach as to how to give shape and lend life to these notes. And so in that sense, when you play Bach, you have to, on a piano or any medium, you have to really become a co-creator with Bach. You have to make incredibly many decisions as to, you have to sort of co-build the piece with him almost, It's a blank, page in that sense, and at the same time, it's the most intense page with the notes on it, But that's why there's so many different ways with Bach, which is why he's renewed with every generation and even any single, serious performer. I think when you play Bach's music, you don't discover a personality, but you discover, the whole spectrum of human existence. You discover a society of personalities. And that can even go for a single piece, like the Goldberg Variations. You have kind of a microcosmos of the whole existence there, in my opinion. It's a little bit like with Shakespeare play, like King Lear or something. You don't discover one aspect about these characters, but you see them just like any other living being. They change from day to day, even if they look the same. And that's a beautiful thing. And when you play Bach, you don't ever have to play it twice the same, and in a sense you shouldn't, You should go deeply enough into the music to be able to sort of recreate it from scratch, in a sense, as an improvisation. Even if you're playing all the same notes, but you improvise the interpretation sort of here and there. At least that's how it is for me. You know, I play it with a lot of variation from day to day. Yeah, I think Bach has opened up the doors. You know, he's connected somehow the past and the future in his works, and that can be said about not so many composers in history or writers or painters, but those who did, you know, they did. Picasso certainly would be a great example of this in painting and in Shakespeare and in literature, you know, but it's when you feel like everything that has gone on before those great figures, they take all of it into the work and sort of, you know, have a meeting with all those minds of the past, bring themselves into it, and then they open up this kind of floodgates for the future. I think that's what Bach did. You know, he knew the music of the past so well, and at all, like the whole Renaissance and the early Baroque come together in Bach's works. And then, you know, he's been used ever since by composers who are breaking new ground. His language and his ideas are still being used today to have sort of the new revolutions in music history, so to say. I think sometimes we are obsessed with the idea of old in classical music. But, you know, as with any museum, here we are in Louisiana, maybe my favorite museum in the world. It doesn't really feel like a museum as such. It's a new ground, like a playground of ideas. And that's how you have to see music as well, because once you feel like it's an old museum with this same permanent collection, and you go there and you meet old friends, but they're always in the same context. You have the same perspective, the same everything. It ceases to be art and becomes a library, and I think we must keep that freshness and the playground alive. And it's the same with museums, and the same with anything. If you're directing a play or if you're reading a book, you bring yourself into it inevitably. And the question of new and old with music, I often feel that Bach is the most modern composer, more modern than the living composers I'm working with. You know. So in the sense, you know, I think sometimes this idea of old and that we have to recreate the old as it was created 200 or 300 years ago, that's a ridiculous idea. It's a lazy idea. It's creatively lazy and it lacks courage. That's how I see it. You know, it's you know, because you can't anyway do it. You can't create a society that doesn't have the internet, the phone, the planes, the Second World War happening 70 years ago, the everything that makes our existence today what it is, you know, political history, you know, human history, biological history, everything, state of the planet, you know, it all comes into what we create. And so this idea, you know, if you're going to pretend that you're playing an authentic performance based on how it was done when Mozart was alive, then you better go to the concert hall in a horse wagon. You know, it's an impossible question. You should probably wear a wig as well, and you shouldn't bathe in hot water, really. You know, you shouldn't really bathe for a week before the performance either. You know, there are so many things. You know, you can't be vegan certainly. There are many things that are part of society that change so much, and we have to embrace change and allow it to happen and take it into what we do, rather than trying to create the past artificially. I think what's fascinating about Mozart in particular is our preconceptions when it comes to his music, the myth of Mozart, the baggage we all bring to Mozart, one way or the other. You know, that's different degrees of baggage, but some of us have just seen the movie Amadeus, and, you know, we think of that whole, you know, wonderful Hollywood drama. But then there are others, like myself, who have actually been playing the music of Mozart and growing up with it since I was 6 or 7. already at that age, when I was 6 or 7, my parents and piano teacher were sort of thrusting the myth of Mozart upon me, telling me about the genius of all geniuses, the Wunderkind, the prodigy of all prodigies of all time, and almost like scaring you with the incredible divine kind of gift of Mozart. And he did have that divine gift. I remember when I was 7, I saw The Magic Flute. It was the first opera I ever saw, and at the end of it, I was kind of pale in my seat because I thought Mozart probably wrote The Magic Flute when he was 7. But of course, Mozart was not 7. He was in the last year of his life when he wrote it. But the feeling of Mozart is always this kind of, I can't touch him, because he's so beyond the ordinary, human people like me and the rest of us. And then, you have to come to terms with Mozart, and you have to go so deeply and spend so much time with him to feel free in his music, to feel less inhibited, in it. And I think what I was fascinated by with this album, Mozart and Contemporaries, is basically that idea of Mozart as the Wunderkind is, to me, actually, a rather misleading idea. I mean, he was very talented as a young man, but let's say he died when he was 25 and not 35, which is the case. If he had died 10 years earlier, he would not be Mozart to us in the same way. He would, of course, be one of the greats in history and all that, and he would be one of the supreme young talents. But he really became Mozart, the way we understand him, in the last 10 years of his life, not as the Wunderkind, but rather as a grown-up. And that's when his music fundamentally changes. I mean, really changes. And there are many reasons for that. One reason is that 10 years before he died, he discovered the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, and that really opened up, these floodgates of new ideas for him. But it's also to do with everything else. He was no longer in fashion with the aristocracy. He wasn't the little puppet, the little favorite, child of the gods. And so they rejected him, and there were many people who were jealous, towards him, and he had to really restart himself, and it didn't go so well for him. It went okay for a time, and then he really fell out of fashion. And the interesting thing is that, the greater the music became, the less popularity he had. It reached the point that, he was trying to sell a subscription to a published work, the string quintets, the late quintets, and he only could gather one subscriber, in Vienna, one person, which shows, he had sunk that low in popularity, but music was really going to the spheres, it was really going into the future, into the 19th century. It was unbelievable. And those extremes in his life fascinate me. And the fact that in these 10 years, if we wouldn't have those 10 years, if he had died 25, we would not have the great operas. You wouldn't have Don Giovanni, the Magic Flute, Così fan tutte, the Marriage of Figaro. You wouldn't have the late symphonies. You wouldn't have the late piano music, the great piano concertos. You would not have them. They were all written in these 10 years. The late, it's like the string chamber music is some of the greatest chamber music that has ever been written. And this he did sort of when he was on his personal quest for freedom, both artistically and personally. He was fighting away from the overwhelming influence of his not so nice father. He married the love of his life, Constanza Weber, to the disgrace of the father, and it was a huge rift. He basically, is in a society that's changing. At 1789, 2 years before he dies, you have the French Revolution that would change the social structure for all years to come. And it's really a bad thing that Mozart died so young. And sometimes we pretend that everything is the way it should be, and this was meant to be like that. It wasn't. Mozart really belonged to the 19th century in spirit. He was the first Romantic artist. And he was the first indie artist as well, because when the aristocracy turned their backs on him, he actually started his own concert series, hired musicians, hung up posters, sold tickets from his apartment in Vienna himself. He did everything, Constanza, his widow, would say that he actually died from overwork, But he belonged to a new era where the artist was a free thinker and not a servant of capital. And that's the great tragedy for music history, that he died so early. Imagine if he had had more time and would have had a dialogue with Ludwig van Beethoven, who after all was only 14 years younger than Mozart, even if we feel like they're almost in different worlds. Yeah, I think music always reflects the time it's written in, and I think you can hear to a degree, at least you can see glimpses into the society of that day. But if it's really great music, it really transcends that day at the same time. So paradoxically, it's two things, you know. It is, so when you listen to Mozart, you really do feel the late 18th century, you feel a changing world. With Beethoven, it's the same. You feel, you know, you do feel the tensions in society. You feel sometimes the presence of Napoleon. You know, you do feel, you know, all those things. But it's also usually so far ahead of its time. You know, when it comes to people like Mozart and Beethoven, that it also seems to always connect to our society. But it's also, you know, how you know, great art is open to interpretation and has to be, you know. So a great painting isn't one thing, even if the painter himself or herself say it's about this, it's not necessarily only about this. And that's the beautiful thing. If you would have Beethoven alive and he would play the last piano sonata, which I think is maybe the greatest piano sonata of all times, it wouldn't still be the truth. You know, even if he wrote it and he would play it and we would listen to it, sure, it would be probably the most interesting and beautiful thing in the world, but it wouldn't be the truth, because there is no single truth. Because I think if he would play it the next night here in Louisiana, it would be a very different performance and it would be a new truth, you know. But there isn't a single truth, and that's really important to remember. I mean, I take a lot of influence from working also with some of today's most wonderful living composers. You know, last week I was playing with Thomas Ades, his piano concerto in 7 days, which to me is the piece of the century so far. It's really such a masterpiece that is hard to describe. It feels, in a sense, a little bit like The Rite of Spring, not in character, but rather in the fact that it doesn't feel like it was commissioned. It feels like it had to be written. And with Thomas on the podium conducting, and I was playing the piano part, we did so many decisions and we changed so many things from what he had written 12 or 13 years ago, you know, dynamics, tempos, everything. We changed a lot of things in terms of how the piece goes, even if we were playing the notes. He's a composer, and so we were basically changing, you know, many of the things he wrote. And then, you know, so I have that experience, and when you work with the living composers, they're so flexible about, you know, the notation. Not necessarily about the pitch or the rhythm, but rather about, you know, not the actual notes, but they're a little bit like Bach in the sense that, yeah, so there is a structure, there are the notes, you know, there's the proportions inside the music, but apart from that, you know, it's fantasy and it has to be created here and there. And so when you work with Tom Ades or John Adams, who is my other composer this season I'm working with, he's conducting his own pieces, and I'm playing, then you come to Bach and Beethoven and Mozart and those guys, and you feel maybe a little bit liberated, because then you get a sense that you don't have to be afraid of the score either. You know, that's not to say that you don't study the score and respect the score and love the score, but the score is one way. It's like a notated performance, you know, initiated long before the notion of recording, for instance, you know. And I think, you know, the performers who are also composers, or composers who are performers, those are usually my favorite types. People who play music by others, but who also know what it feels like to write music. I do that. And I think it's the same with the composers. When the composers are actually performers themselves, they think differently about, you know, how they notate it. And then if you have some who are not really performers, like Arnold Schoenberg wasn't really a performer, there's a tendency to over-control it and over-notate it. And if you do that, you may be doing disservice to your music for future generations, you know, because in the end, I think music will survive mostly based on its ability to sort of be reborn, you know, with each generation and each individual. Well, the beautiful thing about music is that you don't have to convince anyone of anything, and you don't have to defend art in a sense. It defends itself somehow. With classical music, we've actually never had a better period than just now. That goes for young people and old people. It's a strange thing. In COVID, you know, the streams of classical music have gone through the roof. My streams on Spotify alone are more than 100 million. That's only one person a year, you know. and then you take the rest of it, and it's just, and I'm this one person, and then you take all the people making music and recording music, and all the streams and all the accessibility of people to culture. You look at Beethoven on YouTube. It's numbers that we can't even. I mean, I just look silly if I start to say these numbers because they're so sort of astronomical. And think about when the music was written. Mozart and Beethoven, they would premiere their pieces for like 300 tired, old, rich Viennese aristocrats who were drunk and sleeping in the concerts. 300. You know, that's about the size of Louisiana Museum here. You know. But this would be the premiere of a Mozart concerto, and then nobody else would hear it, you know, maybe for years, you know. That was supposed to be the golden age. These days, you know, at any given moment in the world, you will have thousands of people listening to Bach, Mozart, you know, it's really a part of their lives. Young people actually are listening much more to classical music than they have ever done in history. It's because they don't call it classical. That word is a misleading word. Classical seems to imply library or the wrong kind of museum, and I'm happy to just get rid of that term and just call it music.